Pyramid Lake Paiute Tribe from Nixon, Nevada. We originally called ourselves the Dakota, and that's very common among the tribes and bands of Nevada or this western region. Identified themselves by what they ate. It was not until the settlers came over and the army came over and started to, determine and deliver the executive orders, which laid out the boundaries and the provisions of who's in the tribe, what the tribe would be called, where we got our names of like Pyramid Lake Paiute. So naturally, our people were around the lake, and that was a primary staple. The kiwi is a fish that can only be found in Pyramid Lake, nowhere else in the world. They say it has a cousin in the Red Sea. So we were Kiwi Dakota. That's what we are known as, is by what we ate. As you travel throughout the state of Nevada and beyond, you'll find trout eaters, a guide Dakota, tule eaters, toy Dakota. Everybody was named by what they ate. That was a big part of your identity. Another part of your identity and introduction is allowing people to know who you come from. So not only does saying Kiwi Dakota tell you the place space of where you come from, but then you also tell your family line. Who are your relatives? So when, as Native people, knowing where we come from, who you come from, those are really, really big, important tellers of who you are as an individual today. So myself today, Kelly Harry, coming from Jean Harry, Charlotte Harry, Esther Davis, Numaga and beyond, tells people how I've been raised, things I should know, personality, it tells a lot. So just like the language translated, native language translated into English, you lose a lot in translation. You lose a lot of meaning. You lose a lot of humor. You lose a lot of senses. It doesn't quite translate the same. So if I say my name's Kelly Harry, I'm from Nixon, Nevada, member of the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe, we lose all that different meaning of what it means to be a Pyramid Lake Paiute tribal member. Kiwi Dakota, who is the family there? All of those things are really important when we're talking about language, culture, and resiliency, which I would like to talk with you about today in respects of reopening and starting school. So welcome today to our building our state capacity through the Comprehensive Center. Region 17, we focus on Idaho and Montana. Today's presentation is incorporating language and culture in schools reopening plans as an integral piece to student success, right? So we will share evidence-based examples and strategies that are key to enhancing student academic achievement and social emotional well-being. Our objective is, yes, to use the culturally relevant data and evidence to promote academic and community success for your Native students in your schools. So before we get started, I would like to get to know you guys. If you guys can flood the chat, please tell me which school, which district you're from, what grade you teach, if you're an administrator or a different personnel among the district. I'll go ahead and we'll take 1 minute to go ahead and type that into the chat, please. Good morning, Cindy. Good morning, Karen. Very nice to see you and meet you all. Good morning, Todd. Good morning, Scott. Thank you for participating. Same to you, Marie. Good morning, Stacy. So exciting to talk with you all this morning and to be here with you all. So the next thing I would like you to try is we are going to try to collaborate together and work with each other on a Google Jamboard. Some of the things that your students and your teachers may be very familiar with after this last year of distant learning or pandemic. And go ahead and put that Google link in to the chat. So go ahead and click on the link that says Jamboard. See if you're able to access the Jamboard. All right, Marie's in. Looks like we have a lot of, everybody's able to get in there. Perfect. So the first thing I would like to share with you this morning, and that we're going to use the Jamboard for, is taking a look at starting with examining six culturally responsive teaching practices that have been identified by the REL through the Comp Center. And if you go to slide 1, sorry, I didn't have that on slide 1. I would like to share with you these 6 culturally responsive practices that foster learning during school closures, as identified as being, highly effective in closing gaps, right, and for remote learning to increase connections between schools and families. These are meant to dissolve artificial separations between students' academic experience and their lived experiences at school, home, and their community. So because of the physical separation, educators have had the opportunity to employ culturally responsive practices, and these are some of the ones that they've come up with. Construct and enact an equity vision, right? This framework of full and equal participation. How do we get all our students to engage in learning? How do they have internet access? Are they able to join online? Do they have, the school materials they need? All of those things became really important to giving structure, right? And to create an equity framework. Building relationships and collaborating with families to understand the stresses and anxieties that could impact, students' learning. So, teachers really had to work, to understand the needs. Support students, families, and communities by exploring social justice and community issues. So what was happening in the communities? How did the school know about it? How did the school respond to it? Engage students by building on their experiences. Were those being brought into the classroom each day or reflective, or are those as reopening? Are those coming back? Engage in self-reflection to foster equity. Now with those 6 things on the Google Jamboard, I have a question up there on slide 1. What do you and your school, what did you guys do really well, or what are you doing really well to provide this culturally responsive teaching in these 6 areas? And I have those 6 areas again listed in the yellow. And how do you do it? What's your strategy? I'm going to go ahead and break you guys out into groups, into equal groups. You may be with new people, but it'll give you a chance to talk and think in a smaller group, go ahead and use a sticky note. Are you all familiar with how to use Google Jamboard? So if you're not, on the sidebar here, there's a sticky note. You can go ahead and click on your sticky note, choose a different color if you'd like, and go ahead and type in your strategy. What do you do well? How do you do it? And when you've typed in your information, it will post it on the board. You can resize it. You guys can add your names to your group member names. But we'll go ahead and break out into groups now, and we'll just take about 3 minutes to do that. Great.
Kelly, did you want to go into either of the 2 rooms?
Oh, yeah. So right here on this box, I could click join.
Yeah.
And then I'll come back out to a room. Okay. Thank you so much for your help.
You bet.
Hi guys, sorry. I was in with group one and talking, and we were just finishing up a sticky note. Scott, you were telling me about the PLCs, and do you mind sharing with us a little more and I can finish up? Oh, if he's back. So Scott was telling us something that worked really well with them was the PLCs, and I didn't get to hear the full information there, Scott, on that. The building relationships. How did you do that? Which group posted building relationships? Or is there somebody who would like to explain about building relationships? What worked? How did you do that? What was the strategy for building relationships?
That was our group, Kelly, and it was Gail O'Donoghue. So Gail, do you want to expound on that a little bit?
Sure. I'm sorry. I wasn't sure which group it was. So I didn't want to jump in there if it wasn't, it wasn't us. I'm fortunate in that I work for 3 charter school LEAs. Overall enrollments are fairly small, 400 or less at each of these LEAs. So for us, it's always, been easy to build those relationships. We see parents and guardians and such every day, many of them. And so like the half of the year or 3/4 of or quarter of that year in 1920, where we had to go online and everything, we still saw our families every day at lunchtime. Not all of them, but a good majority of them, because we were handing out the free lunches and such. And then over the summer, then when we were making our plans to come back into in-person learning last fall, and again this fall, of course, we communicated with our parents through social media and through our emails and such accounts with them, and just keeping them updated and allowing them to give their input if they wanted to as to our plans. When we began last fall, then we had a lot of buy-in and a lot of appreciation for what we had done and we were able to stay with in-person learning all last year. And the same seems to be true this fall.
That's awesome. So that's great. That's exactly, the goal of building relationships, right, is to allow that feedback and that time for input. It's really important, and the difference it makes in the parent or the families or the students to feel like they've been heard, negative, positive, whatever it is, but they've been heard, and they feel like there was some action and accountability, which is, provides us our buy-in. And then the appreciation, yes, because of all the planning during COVID. Thank you so much, Gail, Karen, for you guys' group conversation. Focusing on trauma, yes, that was a huge thing with and coming back in the trauma-informed, providing the individualized personal learning for each student. I love that. That's the group want to expand on that. How did you do that? Did you set up online Zooms, or were you in person? How did you identify your students? Can the group who wrote on this kind of explain a little bit about that?
That was Cynthia Orse. Cynthia, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I work for Department of Juvenile Corrections, and so our kids were in school every day. And so one of the things that we focus on is building relationships with our student. We have small class sizes. They are between 6 and 10 kids in a classroom. So we get to know our students, and every child in that room is 6th through 12th grade and graduate high school. They've graduated high school, and we put them in college. So we have to meet all of their needs and their different requirements. But over the last year, we've really been working on trauma-informed instruction and how to work with our students, because obviously our kids have been through trauma. And so how to approach them in their education so that it makes it more accessible to them based on their experiences, and turn their fear of learning into a love of learning before they leave us.
Yes, that's so amazing. And without, really understanding that individual and what they've been through, right, you probably couldn't, really meet their needs, right, or turn that fear into love. So yeah, there's definitely an individual level. And Scott, we kind of got cut off on your PLC conversation with the teachers. That worked really well for you. You were mentioning throughout providing the culturally responsive teaching. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? I'm sorry, because we broke out of the room right at that time. Thank you, Cynthia, so much for sharing.
So we just created a new master schedule at the middle school over there, and built in a 30-minute period where we could work with students in a smaller group size. PLCs suggest that, and our district adopted PLCs a couple of years ago. And so to give that 30-minute, I called it a sugar shot for kids. If they were missing or not understanding a concept, that was something we were able to do and really kind of assist and help them out in the long run to be able to be better students in the classroom and understand maybe a specific curriculum or a specific concept better.
That's awesome. That's amazing. Yes. So really designating out that time to, again, build those relationships, understand what the issue is, how can I help you, providing those check-ins. So that's great. That's exactly where I wanted us to start, and looking at these 6 things. One more slide. What practice could you use more information on slide 2 for effective implementation and culturally practice, just out of these 6, since we're looking at these 6 here. And so just individually on the Google Slides, if you can just put on a sticky note, which of the promises could you use more information on, or promising practices? And the link for this this article that we're talking about, I just put in the chat. Thank you, Michelle. Michelle is helping out with everything today on our Zoom meeting, and I really appreciate her. Thank you, Michelle. And I went ahead and put that link in for slide 4. Oh, yes. Oh, thank you, Michelle. So does everybody have the Google chat? Okay, just pick one of the 6 that are listed there in the yellow. Which one would you say you could use more information for? Okay. Leanne says building relationships. Supporting students' families and addressing social justice and community issues. These are all really, really important when we're talking about our Native students, and I'm going to get into that right after everybody has a chance to post on. We'll just take about one more minute. So not only is all of this important for all students in public education, right, but for our Native student population, almost 90% of our students attend public school. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why language, culture, and resiliency, public school, charter school, BIE school, is pretty important to meeting the needs and our goal, again, to increase academic achievement. How do we do that? So I'm going to share with you some evidence-based examples. These are 6 right here that you have and can use. There's also on this link that I provided to you that have these 6 promising practices. There's an evidence to insight coach that will help you examine all of these. This is a address and put that. So in the article here, down underneath, engage in self-reflection to foster equity. This is a great tool, superintendents, teachers, principals, administrators, everybody to use to examine how your culturally responsive practices are improving student outcomes. So again, that link is built into this website. I've also placed it into the chat. If you were to click on that link, you're going to click to continue. And it's bringing you to e2icoach.org. See clearly, act quickly, lead confidently. This is a evaluation tool. You can go ahead and put in your information. It will help to analyze your data and help find you some research-based practices that could be helpful in planning out where and how you can provide a more effective, culturally responsive approach. So just a good tool, again, to use. This is in the link on the PowerPoint. You all are going to get this PowerPoint that has all these links embedded. So moving forward and looking at Idaho and Idaho's plan for reconnecting with students through the American Rescue Plan, their ESSA plan. These are the student populations, the student groups that Idaho really wants to focus on, that they feel have been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic quite a bit. So we're looking at students from low-income families, students from racial ethnic groups, focusing on underserved students by race or ethnicity, gender, English learners, children with disabilities, students experiencing homelessness, foster care, migratory students, or students who have missed the most in-person instruction during the past 2 school years. So the top 3 strategies that Idaho identified in their ESSA report for supporting student needs was in-person instruction. I think that was huge. When I was talking with Scott, in our breakout group. Equitable access. How do we make sure everybody has the same opportunity to the same learning environments? And then teacher preparation. So making sure teachers had training on virtual classroom strategies, distant education resources that are out there. So ways that that you can support your teachers or provide online resources and access that are specific to your native students' language, culture, and resiliency is through the REL Northwest Tribal Educators Alliance. Idaho is a part of this. So the objective is to increase awareness and effective strategies for programs serving American Indian students, increase resources that support Native students' academic success, tribal consultation, and honor principles of tribal self-determination and in education. So these are two terms, tribal consultation and tribal self-determination, that I just wanted to come back to the Jamboard. If you all can go to slide 3 on the Jamboard, what does tribal consultation and tribal self-determination mean to you? And if you've never heard of it before, you can go ahead and put on your sticky note as well, because I think understanding those two terms are pretty important in moving forward and thinking about how do we meet our needs of the American Indian students. Where do they fall into these categories of Idaho's plan for addressing student groups? A lot of our students fit into a lot of those different groups of migratory learners, EL, gender, underserved. They're definitely part of the racial ethnic group, as if they're members of a federally recognized tribe as well, they have a different political status. American Indian students are a part of a protected class, right, federally. So how are we meeting their needs? What are these legal terms and these legal strategies that surround American Indian students that kind of make them, if they're federally recognized, or part of protective class? And so that's where this tribal consultation and tribal self-determination comes in to play with our American Indian students, who are, again, within the public school system of all students. So thank you so much. Tribal consultation has to do with consulting tribal leaders, organizations, very, very good, that represent our students and their needs. What is culturally appropriate is culturally supportive, holistic approach, right? Like understanding, and we kind of mentioned that and talked about those things that worked well for us in slides 1 and 2. You really have to understand all of those different things about the individual student in order to meet their needs. So not only are a lot of our students just coming to school, but they're coming to school from as a member of a tribe or a family, or that have a lot of issues, or may have a lot of wants and needs that may also need to be heard or expressed in order to gain the buy-in, right? Have the appreciation, make that contact, or feel to have the students and families feel supported, or the tribes and the communities feel supported, so we can get their full engagement, so we can turn maybe some fear into love. And the fear is, again, having to do with a lot of federal policy that have affected tribes and families throughout the time. I know many of you probably know a lot about the different boarding school stories that have recently come about. But that was a federal and policy, again, that was pretty traumatic to our students, our families, our communities. When we talk about historical trauma, do some of those still carry down and plague communities? Is there a fear? Is do we need to get their buy-in, right? And this is self-determination. In case you guys are wondering, what is self-determination? Well, self-determination, again, is another federal policy that's impacted federal tribes. This came after the boarding school era, where it said tribes have the right to determine who can be in their tribe, right? Blood quantum, tribal membership, self-government. They can decide how they want to run their government, create their laws, and also how their children will be educated, right? So some of these, a lot were made into state compacts, right, that provided then the public education. Federal policy, again, stated that states would be responsible for providing education and providing public schools to tribal communities within a 20-mile distance. And also, but tribes also have, no longer are mandated now to send their children to boarding school, as it was federal policy before. That was part of self-determination now, because currently there are a few boarding schools still operating, right? But it's not mandated. It's not a federal policy that says all Indian children have to attend, right? That's the self-determination in education. Part of that background of the policy and why it came about was the detrimental effects to not only when we think about the trauma of boarding schools and these stories, but the loss of language and culture, and how that impacted students' identity, students' academic achievement, how those things play into, when we think about that holistic approach in a student, or we think about that individualized student learning plan, or how are we engaging families and communities, right? These things really come into play there. So Tribal Educators Alliance, for short, TEA, we call, offers, and Michelle, if you can go ahead and put that link in on slide 7. This link, Tribal Educators Alliance, has some resources here. You can see members of who are part of this. You may know some of these members, as some of them are from your state, but they have these resources here that are meant to assist you, research-based, evidence practice to improve academic success among Indian students, improve public education systems, right? Enhance tribal consultation and collaboration, and honor the principles of self-determination in education. So why are those things, again, important to a student or a community, right? If you weren't sensitive or aware as to the needs, right, students could negatively be impacted. For example, migratory learners, right? As we think about migratory learners, we know Native families, because of federal policy, right, were moved from traditional homelands, or traditional homelands and hunting grounds were condensed down. We also know that, because of boarding school, a lot of those traditions weren't able to be carried on or passed down to generations. But as policy is meant to improve for Indian communities and students and families, we see a lot of families that are working to revitalize their language, their culture, and their traditional practices. However, these traditional practices and cultures may not align with your master schedule, your master calendar, or the teacher's curriculum outline, right? Maybe it's during a time that's during finals that they're, thinking about, or they're conducting a traditional practice. So this is where tribal consultation, again, becomes pretty important, because if you're not consulting with your local communities, your tribes, your students, your families, to kind of think, are there dates and times that maybe we should plan about, or when we're looking at individual student needs, are we allowed to, or are we going to work with the student on allowing them extra time to complete work, or how will we make up that learning loss as well? We're all thinking about that during COVID, that time out of class. A lot of times we see, these things negatively impact students by, maybe marked for truancy, be not allowed to make up work for full credit, maybe not allowed to make up work at all. But again, understanding why they may miss school for activities like this, that they're already facing some cultural barriers. And if our schools and our teachers aren't understanding or lacking the knowledge or understanding of the traditions of our local communities and Native communities and students, we might be missing a big step in their academic achievement or creating another barrier. So identifying and supporting migratory students, right? And this is different from migrant students. There's a difference in terms. So migratory is during our cultural seasons and times, our students, they may live in permanent housing or established homes, but they may be traveling to go gather, berries, pine nuts, fishing, hunting. So engage with the communities, promote that cultural resiliency that we value and we honor that part of you, but we also, value and honor your learning here. So what identifications, supports can we provide to make sure that you're able to academically achieve as well as maintain and enhance and promote your cultural knowledge and traditions, right? So those are things are able to pass on. Again, these are things students are walking in with, again, as just kind of part of their legal background or as a protected class. So that's a resource that's available to you through that link. Strategies for improving accuracy on Native and identification is another infographic here and video that's provided. Sorry. Can you all see this video?
We can see it. Yep.
Okay, let me see. Next thing is, can you hear it?
Quality education. For many students, this includes having access to
Sound check. Can everybody hear that? Yes? Okay, thank you. So this is another thing, understanding your students, why identification matters. This is all, research-based, proven. Again, if we know the individual student, right, we can provide the correct supports for them. They're going to succeed.
services and supports that can help them succeed in school. American Indian and Alaska Native students are eligible to receive.
One last thing, if everybody can listen for one piece of new information they may have not known about American Indian students through this video or why it can help, we're going to do a share at the end. So get a sticky note out or on your note paper, listen for one piece of new information.
Receive unique educational supports from a variety of programs. However, each year, many Native students do not receive the services they need and qualify for simply because they are not identified as Native. Accurate identification of Native students is crucial for Native communities in several ways. First, accurate identification helps ensure that the programs designed to support Native students are being appropriately funded. Next, accurate identification helps uphold federal treaty obligations. When Native students do not have access to Indian education programs, their treaty rights are violated. Finally, accurate identification is needed to help schools and communities reliably track Native student achievement. So how can you support accurate identification of Native students? A good place to start is to be aware of some misperceptions about Native youth. Native youth identity is complex. You cannot identify Native students simply based on their appearance or where they live. For example, more than 3/4 of Native students are in schools that are not located on or near an Indian reservation. In fact, the majority of Native students in the United States are enrolled in urban school districts. An important thing to keep in mind is that Native students may be connected to their heritage in different ways. Not all will be enrolled in a federally recognized tribe. Some will have no contact with their heritage or traditions, and many identify as multiracial. Teachers and school staff members can help improve accurate identification by engaging with families and tribal communities to help determine which programs Native students might be eligible for. Native Youth Count is a resource that can help clarify the circumstances in which Native students are eligible for different services. For example, if you have students who are members or descendants of a federally or state recognized tribe, they may be eligible for different Indian education programs under Title VI, including summer programs and tutoring services. For Native families with young children, Head Start offers early learning programs and school readiness resources specifically designed for Native students. Not all programs require tribal membership. Many are based on specific circumstances. For example, Native students who have moved in the past 3 years with or to join a parent seeking seasonal employment may be eligible for migrant education programs. And students who have a physical or mental disability may be eligible for culturally responsive special education services. Native Youth Count can help schools and families identify programs that Native students might be missing out on. For teachers and school staff members, consider having a few copies of this tool on hand to share with families or colleagues. Successfully engaging with Native families and tribal leaders is essential to help improve accurate identification of Native students. Traditionally, educators might start their engagement efforts by inviting families or tribal leaders to come to the school. Instead, think about how you can meet with Native families and tribal leaders in places or at events that are important to them, such as a community gathering or even a sports game. It can take some effort to move beyond the typical model of inviting Native families and tribal leaders into the school building, but it is an important part of respectfully engaging with Native communities. Consider creating an engagement plan for your school or district. Working toward accurate identification of Native students is an ongoing process. Here are 3 actions you can take immediately. Share what you've learned about Native student identification with your colleagues. Develop a plan for reaching out to tribal community resource centers and Native families. Review school and district policies that may inadvertently contribute to misidentification or service gaps for Native students. Together, we can ensure that all Native students get the support and services they need to thrive.
So if we can flood the chat. So in the chat message, go ahead and share. We're going to share out step 1. What did we learn? What's the one piece of new information we gained from that? While you're typing that, I'm just going to kind of recap again what the things we've talked about. We talked about building relationships and families, right? Sometimes the traditional model of inviting the families in or getting the families in because of the different work schedules or the migrant learning, or like we've talked about, the traumas of past historical federal policies. There's so many things that come into play, right? We might have to reroute maybe, attending their functions. So how do we reach out to tribal communities? Who's around us? Knowing those local community partners is would, become part of that engagement plan. Who are we going to reach out to, when and how? So the Native Youth Count, this resource, Michelle, if we can put that in on slide 8A, that link into that infographic. Again, this is all, you'll get the presentation. It has all the links, but in case you want to go ahead and save that in now. So examples how Native Youth Count on that tool, the infographic, it showed you the different programs that are available. Some of the programs can be designed between you and community partnerships, like when they talked about the special education. If the students have a physical or mental disability, right, they can receive culturally responsive strategies and programs and teaching, and what that will look like for your local community or that student may be something that's developed individually between you and your community partners. So maybe the tribal education program, or maybe you as a school or district want to kind of develop a pocket that can provide specific services to meet the needs of students that are culturally responsive. Again, no, the migrant, those seasonal activities of your tribe, is kind of part of understanding what resources then can you, provide. And so if in that infographic, it gives some specific programming, but then there's also some open-endedness that can be created between you and your local communities or community partners. So yeah, the majority of Native students are enrolled in urban schools. How many Native students in Idaho are not identified or either urban or rural? And there's usually quite a bit of students who are not identified as either, or like the video mentioned, are not a member of a tribe. So maybe they didn't fill out the correct student identification form, which is usually like a 504 form to be counted, or they think because they're not enrolled, they're not eligible for services, which is, again, not true. They definitely can still receive all the same information and services. And how many students, again, that aren't connected to a community, but maybe are seeking some cultural knowledges and practices, right? Those are ways that, again, schools can be a big player in making sure that these students' needs are met, or they're getting over the fear of wanting to participate in cultural activities because they know it's supported, right, by the school, by the district. And then again, we start to see this love blossom because we know that this support is working both ways. So thank you. And so the urban schools, again, because of these laws that were passed, right, and state education and being able to provide that public education for American Indian students as well, that's where we see a lot of public schools located on or near reservations, or maybe that's the closest, that urban center is the closest to the Native community. And so you'll see more funding, put into providing education at that school than building a rural school. And again, those are different federal Indian policies that say, public school needs to be provided so many miles away from home for primary, so many miles away from home for secondary. So new pieces of information. Any other new pieces of information? Step 1, share with your colleagues new pieces of information that we've learned. That video, so that's a resource for you. As the video mentioned, and that video matches our infographic, those are really handy to have on hand. Familiarize your school secretaries, staff with those, have those available to anybody who's seeking programming or services. And then know, know your area. How can you point them in the right direction? So that's Tribal Educators Alliance. So that includes Idaho, right? That includes Oregon, Washington, Montana, all the tribes in the Northwest. The states, right, are being represented, and these resources are here for you. So this was another video you can go back and watch. When you receive the PowerPoint, again, hearing student testimonials, teachers, how this changes the perspective and the outlook for students who feel that they are supported, that they don't have to disconnect themselves from who they are when they get to school to be another person, and and keep up with the mainstream culture. But that both cultures, their traditional culture, language, knowledge, families, communities, is just as important as their academic achievement. So English language learners, a lot of our students fall into this category as well, and are not identified or misidentified as other learning disabilities, when actually they may be qualified for English language services. So although language has lost and students and families may speak English as their first language or primarily as their first language, it may not be, the same English language that's expected in schools or academic achievement, or standardized tests, right, that we're gauging their language on. So reclassifying our students also, if they are identified as EL, to make sure we're reevaluating them and moving them into the correct supports, or moving them out of an EL service is going to be pretty vital for a student's success or non-success. So this infographic, again, this one, Michelle, if you could put that in for slide 9. This will also be in the PowerPoint. Native education collaboration. We'll go ahead and put this link in there as well. So this is slide 12 link. Tribal sovereignty and consultation, why it's important. Tribes have the right to determine who will represent them in the consultation. They have the right to educate, their own students, or that's when we're thinking about language immersion schools. Tribes have the right to educate non-native who will be educating their students. So, making sure these conversations are happening, either, your state education agency or your district, right, is reaching out. Who are the tribal representatives? How can you integrate the knowledge from each other into, a place to start providing these individual plans for students, or provide the flexibility to students and families as we're coming back and reassessing learning, language, and culture, right, through the pandemic. And we're getting to re-know what happened, either, and we might find that maybe something's really enhanced or worked for them during distant learning. So overall themes in Native education is, just another infographic providing you some information about tribal consultation and self-determination. What does it mean to be a tribal member? What are, again, some of those tribal education rights? And then on this link, there's also the Native Education Collaborative study that was done on culture and language. So the study found that rooted in the cultures and language can provide you the culturally responsive teaching that's aligned to state standards. It involves and requires some professional learning opportunities for teachers to become familiar and to focus on the culturally responsive and cultural based curriculum and instructional practices, assessments. How do we assess and be culturally responsive? And how do we provide the appropriate support? So this is a pretty cool site here. We'll go ahead and put that link in slide 19, Michelle. So Native and Cultural Language here, if you go to this website, you scroll down, here's some resources. Here's the study, the Native and Culture and Language Brief. Here's the infographic I just showed you, and here's the quick reference. We're going to go over that. On related links, here's a couple other, we're going to look at this Becoming Visible report and how Idaho fared in that report. And then again, a lot of other resources for you. Illuminative, Native American Education for All. If you're looking for some culturally responsive lessons, Native Knowledge 360 from the National Museum of American Indians. And then demonstration of effective integration of these resources. What does that look like? Okay, so the study said that it has to be integrated into state policy, program, and practices to advance the inclusion of Native history and culture for all students. State policy, programs, and practices advance the inclusion of Native history and culture for curriculum and support the implementation of effective practices that are culturally responsive or culturally based teaching assessments. So that link provides, again, this infographic and the study. Again, so the study in the brief, comes up with how to incorporate Native students so that they're seeing themselves positively, hearing about themselves accurately and presently, and not just only hearing about themselves or their tribe in a past context before colonization or through colonization when the Wild West was won, in the cowboy and Indian stories, right? How do we make those things present, accurate, and respectful to today, where there's a lot of pride and a lot of things going on in current issues when we're talking about the social justice issues. How do we make things modern for students? So learning about the tribes is really important. Building those partnerships between families where you'll get those stories, or you'll get those volunteers in, and then collaborating with your community members, right? So culture-based education into 5 distinct categories. Instruction, culturally based instruction, Native language instruction, Native studies, Native cultural enrichment, and culturally relevant materials. So again, that brief or that link will provide you a lot of resources as well that can be used. And that study, I wanted to really point out, how do we align our assessments with Native values? And why is that important? So it's important because we align to our Native students' values, symbols, and practices of their community. Again, it dissolves that separation between them and their communities and their families. It brings them together, right? So you want to develop a classroom community that reflects the Native practices. Develop ways to challenge the dominant standardized assessment practice, right? And a lot of this comes into PBL strategies. Use authentic measures to develop by teachers drawing on Native local practices. And these practices, are not only good for Native students, but allow non-Native students to see concepts through an alternative lens. So again, I always think of aligning these things with project-based learning, with depth of knowledge when we're getting up to a higher level of thinking. So potential outcomes, the study found what does it look like on a student level, teacher level, and school administrator level. So again, the student level is that hands-on learning and validation of Native identity. Teacher level is providing that student-centered instruction. right? And using native languages and native cultural and traditional knowledge as a vehicle. And promote community involvement at a school administrator level. So, maybe rerouting the route, maybe having to go to the community yourself. So the infographic on language, what I really wanted to point out to you is this one feather, right, out of these 18 feathers, right? One student out of 18 may be familiar or speak and know some of their language. And what does the impact have on that when our students aren't versed in their language, or when they are, right? So if they're versed in their language, this positively impacts educational achievement. So there's something with learning a second language or being able to speak 2 or 3 languages that opens up brain waves, right? And pathways in our brain that allows people to take in new information and apply the new information. But when we've taken a language away from Native students or Native communities, right, then, and we want to think in a neuroscience manner, how has that affected, our learning systems, right, for our students? So again, incorporating Native language culture, understanding the consultation and the tribe's rights, right, understanding these culturally responsive practices become pretty important. And then developing, materials maybe specific to your state. I just wanted to show you an example from Oregon Department of Education, who's developed these pretty neat lessons that are that are specific to their tribes and then Oregon tribes overall. So that may be something that your state is interested in talking and doing about. So becoming visible, this was a national study. I just wanted to show you really quick because Idaho scored really well in this. A landscape of the state efforts to provide Native American education for all. So in this report, barriers that were identified by states, right, was lack of access to curriculum on Native tribes and students, right? So that's why either accessing those resources or developing your own lessons that can provide those learning opportunities to your state, is pretty important. Another barrier was adequate funding and state support staff to support these things, technical assistance, professional development, evaluation, lack of policy. All right, Gail, thanks for coming. So Idaho has 1.5 personnel designated, right, a state education agency, compared to, like, we see Hawaii has 16, Montana 8, right? But that's where Idaho is, which is, I'm so happy that there's one designated position. This report again looked at 3 things: policy and resources, levels of collaboration with tribal government, and curriculum implementation efforts. So again, Idaho, you see here in the red, states included the content Native American standards in their state standards. So versus was it mandated to teach, or is it just included? Does it, are they required to teach it? So Idaho did well there. And then here, the extent of tribal government engagements and advocacy and support for Native American education. Idaho, we see, is scored in the high amount range. So there's a lot of tribal consultation going on between Idaho and the tribes. So Idaho scored in this 9 through 12 range out of those 3 areas, higher, meaning that the state has implemented many components to support Native education, right? They've scored in the higher level of implementation. So that's awesome. When we think about equity, right, where a concern or a discussion we had at the beginning of this presentation was, and a strategy that worked well for Idaho was providing equity based practices. Well, when we think about what is equity and what does that, how does that affect, or how does that work with language, culture for our Native students? We can see under one, inclusive co-constructive planning, right? We have that inclusive communication and outreach, authentic community engagement. Two, school-based support, so positive, inclusive culture, right? Those things are being provided in the classroom. It's diverse, culturally competent, right? And then there's professional support. So either through those developed lesson plans or through specific supports and practices maybe you've developed between you and your local communities that are culturally responsive. And then you're opening up pathways to other curriculum and extracurricular activities for students by honoring the migratory learning process and supporting cultural activities, even if that may mean they may miss school or instructional time, that these things are provided. And then outcomes are three, right? We want to see those equitable opportunities to learn, integrated schooling, right? We want to see a positive social climate because our students feel welcome and accepted and supported, rather than penalized maybe for missing a Friday test to attend a cultural ceremony, in which a lot of times students aren't able to discuss those types of ceremonial activities when they come back to school. So that's important to watch out for. But so what does that mean for academic achievement for American Indian students? Idaho scoring really well. Here's these resources. Here's what we can do. But let's take a current look at where our students are. 2019 state standardized testing results. We see, let me go ahead and ask you guys what you see. If you could go ahead and put into chat, let's flood the chat with an observations of the data. This is for ELA. These are the ELA state scores for American Indian students. I pulled these out by subgroup. Any observations? And if you want to shout it out instead of flooding the chat, go ahead and you can unmute yourself.
Hi, Kelly, this is Karen. So the way I read this is for when you look at all grades together, only about 32% are advanced or proficient in their ELA. And then, so that would leave 41, 51, 61, 68% who are below basic or basic rate. So not proficient. So to me, that says that there's a lot more we can possibly do to support our Native American population.
Yes. So, and that's kind of what I wanted to point out is the majority of our students are scoring below proficient. So even though there's been some great momentum going, as we're reopening our schools, how can we see a difference in these numbers, right? And if you were to look at these compared to the overall achievement, it's almost the other way around. So where you have the majority of your students scoring above, but as we can see all the way down here, if we look at grades 3, 4, 5, right, we see a higher rate, advanced rate, but then 6, 7, 8, right, we start to see it kind of decline. Again, so those early warning systems, tracking, kind of paying attention to our supports for Native students working. Are we seeing, we want to see, right, the flip, the majority on the other side, advanced and proficient. And if it continues to look like this, what can we do, right? Another way is thinking about how do we count students? What's a dropout rate? That's data I didn't pull. Does that affect the achievement rate for below basic? Did we lose any students past 8th grade, moving into high school? So any other thoughts and observations on this? Thank you so much, Karen, for sharing. And we look at our tested rate. We've tested almost all of our students, 99%, 98.8, 99.6% of our students were tested. So 99% of our students were tested. Yes, we have the majority below. So I'm going to go ahead and go over to the next slide, which is math. And if math observation, feel free, shout it out, type it in the chat. Any volunteers?
Hi, Kelly, this is Karen again. It appears that students do better in ELA than they do math.
That's an observation. So math seems to, this be a bigger struggle area. And so again, when we're thinking about culturally responsive teaching in the area of math specifically, what are some of those culturally responsive teaching math strategies or ELA? Or is this a language and cultural barrier? Is this something we need to develop a specific support for that's school, state-based, district-based, or is this a collaboration between a tribe and a district for a summer learning program? But yes, definitely, we see the below basic rate, right, go from 60-something% right to 78%, almost 80% of our American Indian students are scoring below grade level at a test rate of 98.6% of the students tested. So these are, just things to kind of, again, why and how are these resources relevant, important? Again, everything's linked into the presentation for these different practices or resources that are available to you, these evidence-based practices and resources. So I wanted to break out into groups again, if we can. I don't know if we can get the same. Well, we actually have 3 minutes here. So please take a quick look at these quotes. And if I can have a volunteer to share about a quote that stands out to them. Yes, Leanne, thank you for on the data. The secondary shows a big drop in proficiency again. So as the math becomes to get harder, where are we losing them? Those are, things to kind of be thinking about. Did anybody have one quote that kind of stuck out to them here?
Kelly, it's Scott Muir again. As I look at those quotes, it's so telling to our youth, and especially our American Indian youth in these particular statements, that the suicide rates are 1.5 times higher than the general population, that American Indian EL students are misunderstood and underserved. And not to take anything away from these quotes about our American Indian students, but I think we could probably talk about that with a lot of our EL learners as they come into this country and fit some of those challenges of trying to adapt to a different culture and a different society than maybe what they're normally used to or what they've been raised in.
Yes, that's definitely true. And so when we think about public school systems and education for all, how can these practices that are evidence-based to work for native language students, how do those also work for everyone, right? And those are really creating those inclusive classrooms, because not only are you meeting our American Indian students' needs, but these are practices that are also benefiting all students, either through those EL teaching strategies, culturally responsive strategies, those family building and relationship building skills, or community collaborations, but also, again, providing an alternative lens for other students who to receive the same education, right? So that that shift of that student-centered learning. Thank you for sharing, Scott. Just quickly, culturally responsive teaching, Zaretta Hammond. These are things she also talks about, Ready for Rigor, that are other culturally responsive teaching models. We think about awareness, learning partnerships, community of learners, and how do we process information. And that's where her research stems from, is that neuroscience of learning. And when you make a student feel engaged or welcomed, and you work on, you understand their identity and where they come from, how that affects our learning. And so another great resource that we use and promote our work in. So if we're seeing these things in closing, if we're integrating culturally responsive practice and language across our school day, right? If we're improving, we start to improve our climate and strengthen our connection to our community. And if we support social and emotional learning of the whole child development, right? We see these three pieces lead into the blue, promote our academic progress and life success. Okay, so that means we see an increase in student proficiency in ELA and math, right? We see an increase in post-secondary readiness, and we see students come back to their communities as leaders. We see them bringing that knowledge back to, again, rebuild, because their experience was positive. They want to create a positive experience for others. So that being our goal, right? This kind of graphic here being our goal. And again, this is a study. I wanted to show you guys that in this study, National Indian Education, our students identified their family members as being the biggest, they scored here the largest number of who's teaching them the language and culture. But what I found really cool about this is that teachers is the next biggest number of who is teaching students about native language, culture, history, right? And all of those things are really important. So family is huge. Yes, our main staple of getting that knowledge, but teachers are right there behind, as identified by students. However, this one, how many teachers attended professional development specifically for culturally specific instructional practices, grade 4, grade 8, yet never is a big number, right? 1 or 2 times is our next big number. So, seeking out, different opportunities or creating those opportunities within your state in collaboration with your tribal programs is a pretty cool way to start those discussions. So increasing your language use or immersion classes in reopening, I think is going to provide a lot of benefits for your state and districts and your students. Early warning systems and the EL development, not only for your Native students, but how that benefits everybody that in that place-based learning, right? That's our presentation today. Are there any questions, comments? Here's my contact information. If anybody is seeking more information on any of the topics covered, the presentation that has all the links available to you will be sent out. And just any question, a follow-up, or you need support in getting in contact with any of your local tribes, please reach out to me. I thank you guys so much for joining me today in this. Again, this presentation was recorded, so if there's anybody who missed it, I'm really happy that they'll be able to get this information. If you want to, spread the word and say, hey, check out that presentation, or share the presentation with others with all the links that are provided for our Region 17 Comp Center and the research we've done and work we've been doing to support your state and Idaho. All of those links provide our evidence-based practices and research. So thank you all so much again, and have a great day. Please contact me with any questions. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Kathy and Leanna. And Scott, thank you guys so much. Fernando, thank